More often than not, when it comes to the adventures of pirates, the history books and movies often talk about their debauchery or plunder. They talk less about the quiet nights, sailing across the vast ocean, with nothing more than the moon and stars to illuminate the deck, as the ship skips through wave after wave in the deep green blue sea. An example of such a ship is the Lost Dreams. By day and the occasional night, it will sail from port to port, defending the poor where it can. You see, these weren't just any pirates. They were like the Robin Hoods, if you will, of the sea. However, tonight was far quieter. The waters were calm. Musclemouth Mike, as he is known, stands tall and proudly in the sea air, gripping the helm with his large, muscular hands. They somehow manage to make everything look tiny. He nods and shines a brief smile at Peacock, the short, blonde-haired cabin girl below, who has just finished mopping the main deck. She, the helmsman, and Bug-Eye, the lookout, high up in the crow's nest, are the only three of the crew left awake on the ship. Bug-Eye earned his name based on his slightly unappealing face, yet he was a most respected crew member. He can pick up a Spanish galleon before it even comes over the horizon, and see rocks jutting out of the sea quicker than a seagull sees its next meal on an empty stomach. The young girl, Peacock, loves late nights to clean the decks. It is the best time to just be alone with her thoughts. She is around 11 years old, but no one is really too sure. They picked her up after the crew saved a group of children from a particularly horrible slave trader. She hit the captain in the face with the butt of her mop before sweeping his legs with the opposite end, assuming he was just another violent and horrible man. The crew roared with laughter. This tiny girl held her mop as if it was the hardiest of swords, with which she was far more dangerous than 100 pirates. The captain, now with a bloody nose, took a liking to her immediately. She too grew to like the crew as they spent a few days on the island of Cynthia, an island notoriously known as the place to trade slaves away from the prying eyes of the Navy. Her and Mike got on best. She reminded him of his own sister. He tried to teach her to read with badly drawn flashcards on bits of wood with chalk, but the only word she was ever able to grasp was peacock, a word she proudly repeats constantly. Apparently it was the only word with the letter P the crew could think of, although it certainly did not audibly sound anything like the word. The crew cheered and decided her new name was now Peacock. Aboard the ship with her trusty mop in hand, she happily, for once, cleaned the ship from top to bottom, without being asked or forced. Although it was certainly a hard life aboard a ship, it was far easier compared to her life before. Peacock looked out into the deep waters ahead. They had been out at sea for over a week now, and were heading for a port just off Costa Rica. They needed to resupply, and there was an elderly gentleman there called Marcus. He ran a general store on the island, and he always had all the food and supplies they needed for a long journey across the sea. His youngest daughter, Cynthia, liked Peacock a lot, and whenever they arrived back to port, she'd be ready to welcome her with open arms and a new outfit she'd sewn just for her. Mike and the captain had saved both of them some years back from a British naval officer who was notorious for capturing and enslaving anyone who he viewed as inferior to him or the British Empire. Peacock gripped her mop tighter and smiled, excited to see the two again. She peered up at the lookout, Bug-Eye, who appeared to be sleeping. She banged her mop on the mast with some force, which caused him to sit bolt upright. He leered over the edge of his dwelling, high above the deck at the short, blonde girl, who was now walking away with her mop on her shoulder and bucket in hand, attempting to whistle nonchalantly and doing a pretty bad job with it. Mike stifled a laugh, looking briefly down at his guide, the compass, resting in his left hand. Once a shiny brass colour, it had turned into a scratched up, well-worn, greeny blue, with a small crack in the top corner of the glass. A gift his sister had given him some years past. She had found it on the beach of their home island of Madagascar when they were looking for shells together as young children. They would often collect them and make necklaces out of them with their father, necklaces they would then gift to their mother as a thank you. He left some 10 years ago. He still visits them whenever they sail close. He went off with his childhood friend Mumba, the now captain, who originally was a crew member of the ship the Bottleneck. After a few years aboard that ship, both him and Mumba managed to scrape together enough money to build and buy the Lost Dreams, the ship they now sail on. Named as such to go save those who had lost hope. Perhaps due to war or slavery, they no longer had the ability to chase those dreams they once had. This ship would be like a beacon of hope in the dark scenery of this world, or that is at least their goal. He closed the lid of the compass down, a satisfying click as the clasp connects with the little nib. Stuffing it back into a trouser pocket, he returns his hand and grips the helm, looking around the deck to see if he can spot Peacock. He hears an audible growling sound. At first, he's alerted, and then realizing it's just Bug-Eye, snoring again. The sound of footsteps rattling up the deck redirect Mike's attention. It's the ship's marksman Mutton, a name based on his terrible sideburns. He had awoken from his slumber and is making his way across the deck towards the helm. Mike pointed to his ears, then jutted his finger up towards the crow's nest, suggesting a sound is coming from above. A slight smirk crosses Mutton's face as he grabs a rock from his pocket, smooth and grey. He takes a brief look up before throwing the stone in a whipping motion and sailing straight for Bug-Eye's head. Bug-Eye, however, is not only known for his keen eye, also for his reflexes. He snatches the stone out of the air, looking down at Mutton with a piercing stare. He throws the stone back. Despite his keen eye and reflexes, he can't throw at all. The stone ends up a good few feet from Mutton and plops into the ocean. Bug-Eye slumps back down in his nest, looking out at the horizon. Chuckles can be heard below from Mutton's mic and most likely Peacock. He smirks slightly and looks down at his compass, making sure they are still heading in the right direction. His compass, unlike Mike's, was silver, well worn, but in better condition. It has a small sketch tucked into the silver lid. It's of a young lady smiling. It is incredibly well detailed, even down to the freckles on her face. This young lady will be waiting for Bug-Eye when they land in Costa Rica. Her name is Cynthia. She is the youngest daughter of the general store owner, Marcus. The two of them had met after Bug-Eye had quite the evening. He was already down on his luck, and he'd gotten very drunk and accidentally stumbled into a bar fight. Bug-Eye was no fighter, but somehow ended up in front of a very large man with several scars painted over him. His fist alone was the size of Bug-Eye's face, a fact he not moments later could verify. Thankfully, two large men of a ship called Lost Dreams managed to save him. Dragging him out of the fight, they took him to the only place they could think of where he would get help, the general store. Cynthia cared for him and even cooked him meals. While he wasn't that badly injured, he definitely milked it for all he could, as at the time he had no job, no money, and nowhere to go. Regardless, Cynthia saw that he was kind-hearted, sweet, and a very talented artist. He drew the very picture of Cynthia that is now tucked into his compass. Cynthia cared very much for David, or Bug-Eye as he's best known. He promised he'd save up enough money to buy her a ring. The two gentlemen from the ship, Lost Dreams, that had saved him, Mumba and Mike, visited him regularly every time they came up to the store while they were on the island for a few weeks. The general store was at the top of the island and quite some distance from the port, so much so that the ships looked like tiny specks of dust, even on a telescope. So one could only imagine the surprise on both of their faces when Bug-Eye managed to point out and read the lettering on the side of a certain ship in the port called Lost Dreams, asking them if it was their ship and if he could join. Ever since then, some 4 years, Bug-Eye has been stationed in the crow's nest, scrimping and saving money from plunders and bounties, which are split evenly among the crew, so he could buy not only a ring, but a small house for the two of them to live in. Pulling out a small box out of his oversized jacket pocket, a coat he'd taken some years ago from a naval officer, he pops open a small wooden carved box. Inside, resting on black velvet, is a beautifully crafted silver band. It has branches carved into it all around, with deep green emeralds set into the band to form what look like bejeweled leaves. Cynthia is not a conventional person, so naturally she deserves an unconventional engagement ring. Shutting the case closed and returning it to the jacket, a warm smile spreads across his face. Bug-Eye decides to lean back as a second rock whips past his head. He turns his face to peer back at the giggling marksman Muttons, who gets a swift bonk on the head from Peacock's mop. Only Peacock is allowed to torment Buckeye. Muttons rubs his head and smiles at the passing girl. He often wakes up at this time to take in the small hours, with a puff on his grandfather's pipe. Placing an elbow on the railings at the back of the poop deck to support his head, he looks out over the wake, the trail the boat leaves behind, gently cutting through the calming seas. He takes a single puff and allows the smoke to drain casually out of his mouth. Mutton relinquishes a relaxed exhalation. This is the only life Mutton knows. From a child, he was around ships and the sea. He grew up with his grandfather, a fearless and strong fisherman, clad in a threadbare vest and ripped trousers regardless of the weather. Seawater crusted on his large grey beard. To Muttons, he was a hero, and to anyone else who heard the name Grave the Beard. An immortal depiction of a seafaring demigod, a man even great Neptune or Davy Jones would be afraid of. Muttons always, and still does, look up to him, desperately trying to grow a bushy beard like his grandfather. Unfortunately, the beard is patchy at best, with oddly bushy and large side vents, hence the nickname. Regardless, there is one place he follows his grandfather's footsteps. No one is braver or bolder than Muttons on the ship. Rumour among the crew is that he once, on his previous ship, while it was being attacked by slave traders, moved a cannon off a fellow crew member's leg with his arm badly broken and threw it into the sea and risked his own life to save the entire crew, sailing a small boat back and forth as the ship sank. He was smaller than Mike and Mumba, but equally strong, but just as kind-hearted. It can be often considered that pirates are just ruthless and dangerous, thieves and blackguards. Those who do not follow this mould perhaps are weak or inferior. That certainly was not the case for any of the crew under Mumba's leadership. Every last one is a strong, noble, seafaring man or woman. Despite the rest of the crew sleeping, Mumba sat in his captain's quarters, as he often did, planning what supplies he might need and where he should take his motley crew on their next adventure. Mumba was a hefty tree trunk of a man. He'd seen his fair share of fights and the worst of men. He sat on a wooden chair with plush red velvet cushion on the base of the seat. He wore a large, well-worn red coat with gold buttons seated on the long white strips that slid out from the edges of the jacket. He received it from his previous captain, a strong barrel of a man who fought with a small anchor instead of a sword. After 50 years or so at sea, Captain Redbarrel of the Bottleneck stepped down as captain and sought a life of peace away from the high seas. He handed his red coat, perhaps symbolically, to his first mate Mumba as he walked off towards a small fishing village he would call home. Mumba leaned back on his chair, putting his arms behind his head, and turned to look out at the port side window of his quarters. Nothing but water, sky and stars for miles upon miles. Casually tossing his sextant on the large, superannuated map lying on his solid mahogany desk. The map, truly, was no longer fit for purpose. Ports, long since lost to the hands of time, are still marked, somewhat dully, on the map. Yet the Earth does not change as much as port locations. After all, the map was merely a formality. Mumba knew exactly where he was in the ocean all the time. He was, after all, one of the best navigators the crew had ever seen. He had the ocean mapped out almost in his head. Pushing the chair back and standing up, Mumba stretched out his shoulders, walking towards and opening the door, and then stepping out onto the deck of his magnificent vessel. Peacock was standing just by his door. She bobbed a somewhat malformed curtsy to the captain, something Cynthia no doubt had taught her. Mumba smiled, chuckled, and retorted with a casual salute from the tip of his bald head. Taking a deep breath in, the smell of elm and sea air flooded his senses. Bug-Eye was clambering down from the crow's nest and paused as he saw the captain, attempting a half-cocked salute while trying to stabilize himself so as not to fall head-first into the barrels below the rigging of the main sail. Mumba begins to head up the stairs to the helm, hands in pockets, the large red jacket gently flapping in the soft breeze, simply resting on his broad shoulders. Mike and Muttons nodded at the captain, who, in return, smiled. No words spoken, no words needed to be said. The ship was running perfectly, gliding through the water like a warm knife through butter. Smooth. Peacock looked up at the three men, all who were staring out at the big expanse of blue and green. She gave them a brief wave before placing her bucket under the stairs and made her way down into the bows of the ship, tiptoeing over snoring crewmates, bowing and ducking under limp hands dangling out of hammocks. She squeezes her way through a small hole just behind the barrel. There was a gap between the stern and the crew's quarters. It couldn't have been more than 1 meter wide. Regardless, she shuffled down on her makeshift bed, a combination of plush quilts and pillows and coats, all things she'd scavenged from plunders that she'd been involved in. All of them cut or ripped, but she didn't mind. Placing the mop at the foot of the bed, ready to grab just in case, Peacock laid her head back on the soft pillow, picking a feather poking out of it and tossing it down the end of her small dwelling. She reaches out and grabs a small teddy bear. It's brown and grey. 2 green and red buttons set into its head act as eyes, with one larger, oversized patchwork arm. Mike tried to repair it when they first found her, but he's not the most skilled seamstress to ever live, but far better than anyone else on the ship. The crew thinks it was given to her by her parents, although no one really knows. Peacock places it next to her head on the pillow, then drags a large navy coat up to her chin. Taking a deep breath in, a relaxed exhalation passes her lips, quickly followed by a yawn. Peacock shuts her eyes and shuffles slightly to get comfier in bed. She needs to get her rest. It's another big day of adventuring tomorrow.